The Zagros Mountains. A United States B-2 Spirit stealth bomber banked silently through the thin mountain air of central Iran. This was not a freedom of navigation exercise or a routine electronic warfare test. Tonight, the massive weapons bay doors were already cycling open for a target that the world believed was unreachable. The Spirit of Ohio moved at 45,000 feet. It was a billion-dollar ghost in a sky filled with invisible threats. Major Sarah Vance felt the dry air of the cockpit on her skin. Her call sign was Viper. She had flown over every major conflict zone of the last decade. This was different. The rules of engagement had been stripped down to a single sentence: destroy the facility at all costs. Beside her sat Captain David Miller. He was the mission commander. His eyes were locked on the synthetic aperture radar display. The image on the screen was grainy but unmistakable. It was the mountain peak above Fordow. Targeting is solid, Miller said. His voice was flat and professional. The global positioning system signal is clean. The inertial navigation system is synced. We are 3 minutes from the drop point. Sarah checked her fuel state. Copy. The F-22 Raptors are in position. They are reporting no active tracking from the surface. The Iranians are sleeping. They are not sleeping, Miller replied. They just do not know we are here yet. Inside the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar, the atmosphere was a wall of static electricity. General Mark Holden stood behind a row of analysts. He watched the blue icons of the strike package. The B-2 was a faint ghost on his secure link. The F-22 Raptors were flickering dots. He knew that a single mistake here would ignite a regional wildfire. The president had given the order 6 hours ago. The intelligence was verified. The centrifuges at Fordow were being fed high-enriched uranium. The red line was gone. Inside a hardened bunker 5 miles from the mountain, Colonel Abbas Karimi stared at his radar terminal. He was the commander of the local air defense sector. The Russian-made S-300 batteries were his responsibility. The green light of the screen reflected off his glasses. The sky appeared empty. There were no transponders. There were no primary returns. Yet, Abbas felt a physical weight on his shoulders. He walked over to a young operator. "Search the high-altitude corridors again," Abbas ordered. The operator shook his head. "Colonel, we have scanned 3 times. There is nothing but wind and clouds at 40,000 feet. The Americans are staying in international airspace tonight." Abbas leaned over the console. "The Americans do not send carrier groups to the Gulf to sit in international airspace. They are waiting for us to blink. Switch the fire control radar to a low probability of intercept burst. Scan the northern approach." "Sir, that will alert their electronic intelligence planes," the operator warned. "Do it," Abbas said. "I would rather be seen than be dead." Back in the cockpit of the Spirit of Ohio, a yellow light began to flash on the electronic warfare display. It was a momentary pulse. It was faint, but it was there. Sarah spoke into her mask. "We just got painted. Low power. Someone on the ground is looking for a ghost." Miller did not look up from his screen. "Ignore it. We are in the final approach. Do not deviate from the track. 30 seconds to release. Doors are locked open. Weapons are armed." The B-2 shuddered as the massive GBU-57 munitions shifted on their racks. These were the largest conventional bombs in the American inventory. Each weighed 30,000 pounds. They were designed for one purpose. They were built to kill the unkillable. Sarah looked out the side window. The moon was a silver sliver. Below her, the Iranian desert was a vast and lonely expanse of black and gray. Somewhere beneath that rock, hundreds of men were working on a project that could change the world. She felt a sudden flash of adrenaline. It was the moment of no return. The targeting computer began the final countdown in her ear. 10, 9, 8. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. Over the Zagros Mountains at 11:21 at night, Major Sarah Vance watched the electronic warfare suite on her primary flight display. The signal from the Iranian S-300 radar had not just vanished. It had dissolved into a jagged pattern of white noise that made no sense. The digital signatures of the surface-to-air missile batteries were flickering like a dying light bulb. 1 second, they were at full power. The next second, they were gone. Sarah spoke into the encrypted radio link. "Control. This is Ghost 1-1. We are seeing massive signal degradation at the target site. The Iranian air defense grid is oscillating. Please confirm status of local electronic warfare assets. 600 miles away, the voice of the controller in Qatar came through the headset. Ghost 1-1. Control. We have no active jamming platforms in your sector. The EA-18G Growlers are still 200 miles out. We are seeing the same anomaly on satellite telemetry. The entire Fordow power grid is spiking. Captain Miller leaned forward in his seat. He adjusted the gain on the synthetic aperture radar. Viper. Look at the mountain. The ground return is shifting. It is as if the rock itself is vibrating. Confirm. I see it, Sarah replied. Is it an earthquake? Miller shook his head beneath his helmet. The seismic sensors are quiet. This is something else. It looks like a massive electromagnetic discharge, but there is no source. At 11:23 at night, deep beneath the surface of the mountain, Colonel Abbas Karimi stood in the center of the Fordow command bunker. The air was thick with the smell of ionized copper and ozone. Above him, the heavy industrial lights were flickering in a rhythmic, pulsing pattern. Abbas grabbed the shoulder of a technician. Report. Why are the centrifuges accelerating? We are supposed to be at a steady state. The technician was frantic. His hands were shaking as he typed at a keyboard that was barely responsive. Sir, the frequency converters are not responding to our commands. The power is being drawn from the external grid at a rate that should have melted the transformers. But the temperature in the hall is dropping. It is currently 40 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. That is impossible, Abbas shouted. We are in a sealed environment. Turn on the emergency cooling. The cooling is on, the technician said, but the heat is being sucked out of the room. I cannot explain it. It is as if the laws of thermodynamics have stopped working inside this mountain. At 11:24 at night, the Spirit of Ohio reached the final navigation waypoint. The B-2 was now perfectly aligned with the vertical shaft of the Fordow facility. The GBU-57 massive slugs of hardened steel were ready as Sarah felt the aircraft groan. The bomb bay doors were wide open now. She looked at the countdown. 60 seconds. She keyed the radio again. Control. Ghost 1-1. We are at the release point. The anomaly is intensifying. We are seeing a blue glow on the mountain peak. General Holden sat in the dark command center in Qatar. He looked at the live feed from a high-altitude drone. A faint, shimmering haze of blue light was indeed visible around the summit of the Zagros range. It looked like Street Elmo's fire, but on a geological scale. He had 10 seconds to make a decision that could end his career or save the world from a nuclear-armed rogue state. The general spoke into his microphone. Ghost 1-1. This is Control. You are cleared hot. I repeat, you are cleared hot. Execute the strike immediately. Do not wait for the anomaly to clear. Copy. Cleared hot, Sarah said. Beside her, Miller placed his hand on the release toggle. His breathing was heavy and rhythmic. Doors are open. Master arm is on. Release in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At 11:25 at night, the aircraft lurched upward as 60,000 pounds of dead weight fell away into the dark. The two massive bombs vanished into the night. They were guided by satellites and internal gyroscopes. They were falling toward a target that was already beginning to scream in a language no human could understand. Sarah banked the B-2 into a hard left turn. She needed to get clear of the shockwave. But as she looked back at the mountain, she did not see a target. She saw the sky above the Zagros Mountains begin to fold in on itself. The first weapon was seconds from impact. The mountain waited. 11:26 at night. The Zagros Mountains. The two GBU-57 bombs were now 3,000 feet above the surface of the mountain. They were falling at more than 700 miles per hour. Their guidance fins twitched in the cold air. They were correcting for every gust of wind. The Spirit of Ohio continued its steep bank to the west. Major Sarah Vance watched her mirrors. She could see the faint afterburners of the two F-22 Raptors orbiting 10 miles behind her. They were her guardians. They were the most advanced air superiority fighters in history. Tonight, even their stealth was being tested. The lead Raptor pilot keyed his radio. His call sign was Raven 1. Ghost 1-1. This is Raven 1. My tactical display is lighting up. The S-300 batteries at the base of the mountain are active. They are not just scanning. They have a hard track on my wingman. Sarah looked at her own sensors. Raven 1. Ghost. I see it. How is that possible? Your cross-section should be invisible to that legacy hardware. The blue haze, Raven 1 replied. His voice was tight. It is ionizing the air around us. Our stealth coatings are not designed for this environment. We are glowing like flares on their scopes. 11:28 at night. Inside the Iranian Air Defense Center, the mood had shifted to a cold, predatory focus. Colonel Abbas Karimi stood behind the S-300 operator. The green screen was no longer empty. Two distinct, solid icons were pulsing in the center of the display. They were the American F-22 Raptors. They were high. They were fast. They were within the engagement envelope of the long-range missiles. Abbas leaned over the console. Target confirmed. Do we have a fire control lock? The operator nodded. His fingers moved across the control panel. Yes, Colonel. The signal return is massive. It is as if they are not even trying to hide. We have a solid solution on both targets. Arm the batteries, Abbas said. If they cross the 10-mile perimeter, we fire. Do not wait for a second order. We must protect the facility. Colonel, the operator said, his voice trembling. The seismic alarms are triggering. The bombs. The Americans have already dropped their weapons. They are seconds from impact. Abbas looked at the main wall map. The two American heavy munitions were invisible to his radar, but the telemetry from the high-altitude sensors was clear. Something was screaming toward the mountain at terminal velocity. He knew the strength of the Fordow granite. He knew the depth of the concrete. He also knew the power of the American bunker busters. Fire, Abbas ordered. Fire everything at the escorts. If we cannot stop the bombs, we will make them pay for every inch of our sky. 600 miles away at 11:29 at night, General Holden watched the escalation on the big screen in Qatar. The blue icons representing the F-22 Raptors turned bright red. A jagged line appeared between the Iranian S-300 batteries and the American fighters. It was the digital symbol for a fire control lock. Holden grabbed the red phone on his desk. This is Control. Patch me through to Raven 1 immediately. General, you are on the secure line, a technician said. Holden spoke clearly into the receiver. Raven 1, this is Control. You are authorized to engage any surface-to-air threat that achieves a hard lock. I repeat, you have freedom of maneuver and permission to fire. Defend the strike package. Copy. Control, Raven 1 responded. I am engaging. Fox 3. High above the desert, the Raptor's internal weapons bay snapped open. A single AIM-120 missile dropped into the slipstream. Its rocket motor ignited with a brilliant white flash. The air-to-air missile was not aimed at a plane. It was aimed at the radar van near the base of the mountain. At the same time, two Iranian missiles leaped from their canisters in a cloud of dust and fire. The first shots of the war had been fired. The peace was over. The GBU-57 bombs were now 500 feet above the mountain. 11:30 at night. The Zagros Mountains. Major Sarah Vance felt the B-2 spirit level out after the steep bank. The 60,000 pounds of ordnance was no longer a physical weight under her wings, but the responsibility of what happened next felt heavier than the steel. The aircraft was now flying through a sky that had become an active combat zone. Behind her, the two GBU-57 bunker busters were no longer just falling objects. They had transitioned into their terminal guidance phase. They were 30,000-pound darts of hardened steel, screaming toward the Earth at terminal velocity. The targeting computer in the cockpit was no longer counting down to a release. It was now calculating the milliseconds to the impact. Targeting computer confirms the impact point is locked, Captain Miller said. His voice was a low drone against the hum of the cockpit. The GPS signal is holding despite the interference. Those bombs are exactly where they need to be. 10 seconds to the surface. Sarah checked the tactical display. The two F-22 Raptors were no longer hidden. The mysterious blue haze rising from the mountain had stripped away their stealth. They were now visible as bright, pulsing icons on every radar screen in central Iran. The sky around them was beginning to fill with the white streaks of surface-to-air missiles. It was a forest of fire reaching up from the desert floor. 11:30 and 20 seconds at night. Inside the Fordow Command Center, Colonel Abbas Karimi stood at the center of the room. He looked at the overhead monitors showing the centrifuge halls. The blue light was no longer a faint shimmer. It was a brilliant, electric glow that seemed to be bleeding out of the very walls. The scientists were no longer working. They were standing still, looking at the ceiling with expressions of pure confusion. The hum of the machinery had reached a pitch that was painful to the human ear. "Sir, the atmospheric pressure inside the mountain is rising," a technician shouted over the noise. "It should not be possible. We are 300 feet underground." But the sensors say the air is as dense as the bottom of the ocean. Abbas felt a cold sweat on his neck. What about the missiles? Did we hit the American planes? The S-300 batteries have launched 16 interceptors. We have hard locks on both escorts, but the bombs. Colonel, the bombs are already at the mountain peak, 11:30 and 40 seconds at night, 10 miles from the mountain summit. The lead Raptor pilot, Raven 1, slammed his throttle into full afterburner. The sudden thrust pushed him deep into his seat. His vision began to narrow at the edges from the force of the turn. Behind him, 4 Iranian missiles were weaving through the air, their heat-seeking sensors locked onto his engines. He watched his electronic warfare display as it struggled to categorize the threats. The blue ionization was creating false targets on his own screen. "I am taking defensive action," Raven 1 said into the radio. "Control, be advised. The air is acting like a conductor. My flight controls are sparking. I am dropping flares now." The sky behind the Raptor exploded into a cascade of magnesium fire. The Iranian missiles dove into the heat, but 2 of them corrected and swung back toward the fighter. It was a lethal game of physics played out at twice the speed of sound. Raven 1 knew he could not keep this up for long. He needed the strike to finish. He needed the world to go back to making sense. 11:31 at night, 600 miles to the south. General Holden stood in the dim light of the command center in Qatar. He watched the 2 green lines of the bunker busters intersect with the brown circle of the target area. The seismic sensors were primed. This was the point of no return. Every officer in the room was frozen. They were watching the birth of a new reality. The general spoke to his staff without turning his head. "This is it. In 5 seconds, the most fortified facility on the planet will be a memory. Let us hope the intelligence was right. Let us hope we are doing the right thing." The timer on the main screen hit 0. At 45,000 feet, Sarah Vance saw the first flash of light on the mountain. It was not the orange of an explosion. It was a blinding, clinical white. Central Iran. The sky above the Zagros Mountains fractured. The first Iranian surface-to-air missile, an S-300 interceptor, reached its terminal velocity of Mach 6. It was a spear of white heat launched from a hidden valley 4 miles east of the facility. The missile's seeker head, guided by the blue ionization of the air, locked onto the right engine of the lead F-22 Raptor. Raven 1 saw the warning light turn a solid, bloody red. He slammed the stick to the left, but the atmospheric distortion from the mountain robbed his control surfaces of their bite. The missile detonated 2 meters from the Raptor's wing. The warhead shattered the titanium casing of the engine and punched through the composite skin of the fuselage. The right wing of the stealth fighter was ripped apart instantly. Shrapnel shredded the fuel lines and ignited the high-pressure hydraulic fluid. A fireball that turned the sky white erupted from the back of the aircraft. Raven 1 fought the controls as the jet began a violent, gut-wrenching roll toward the desert floor. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burning electronics and JP-8 fuel. "I am hit. I am hit," Raven 1 shouted into the radio. His voice was strained against the massive G-forces of the spin. "Engine 2 is gone. I have a catastrophic fire in the main bay. I am losing flight control. Ejecting. Ejecting. Ejecting." The canopy of the Raptor blew off with a sharp crack of explosive bolts. The pilot was thrown clear by the rocket motor of his seat, a tiny black dot against a backdrop of orange flames. The billion-dollar fighter disintegrated in midair. It became a rolling sphere of burning debris that scattered across the jagged rocks below. The secondary explosions from its own AIM-120 missiles lit up the valley like a string of firecrackers. 10 miles away, inside the cockpit of the Spirit of Ohio, Major Sarah Vance saw the explosion on her peripheral vision. It was a bright, ugly scar in the night. "Raven 1 is down," Sarah said. Her voice was ice cold, but her knuckles were white on the throttle. "The Iranians have confirmed kills. We are taking heavy fire. Where are the bombs? Impact in 3, 2, 1, Captain Miller said. The first 30,000-pound GBU-57 hit the summit of the mountain. The hardened steel nose, reinforced with a tungsten alloy, punched through 40 feet of solid granite in a fraction of a second. The sound was a shriek of tearing metal and crushing rock that could be heard for 20 miles. The mountain face actually buckled inward as the kinetic energy of the weapon was transferred into the geological strata. A massive plume of pulverized stone and dust geysered 500 feet into the air. 2 seconds later, the internal delay fuse reached its 0 point. The weapon detonated 200 feet below the surface. The shock wave slammed into the mountain's core with the force of a tactical nuclear strike. The concussion compressed the very air inside the tunnels, liquefying the reinforced concrete linings of the primary halls. On the surface, the entire peak of the mountain seemed to jump. Thousands of tons of rock were thrown upward and outward. A massive crater opened in the center of the summit, glowing with the dull red heat of friction and high explosives. The vibration was so intense that the seismic sensors at the Pentagon, thousands of miles away, recorded a magnitude 4.5 earthquake. Direct hit confirmed, Miller reported. The first weapon is inside. The second weapon is following the same path. Impact. The second GBU-57 entered the crater created by the first. It drove even deeper into the mountain, seeking the heart of the enrichment halls. The double detonation sent a second shock wave through the Zagros range. The ground below the B-2 looked like the surface of a drum being struck by a giant. Black smoke and gray dust began to pour out of every ventilation shaft and emergency exit at the base of the facility. The target was being hollowed out from the inside. The battlefield was a chaos of smoke, falling debris, and the screaming of jet engines. For 3 seconds, there was a dead silence on the Iranian tactical radio frequencies. Then, voices erupted on every channel at once. They were screaming for damage reports that would never come. The strike was a success. The facility was gone, or so the American crew believed. Central Iran. The sky was a graveyard of falling titanium and burning magnesium as the second GBU-57 bunker buster found the breach. It punched through the weakened granite and detonated 300 feet inside the mountain's primary enrichment hull. The warhead ignited with a force that turned the subterranean air into a white-hot plasma. The pressure wave slammed into the hull of the mountain from the inside out, shattering concrete support pillars into fine dust. The shock wave ripped apart the primary cooling manifolds, turning pressurized water to steam and shredding the aluminum rotors. Heavy steel blast doors were blown off their hinges like sheets of paper and thrown through the air at supersonic speeds. The ceiling of the main hall collapsed inward, dropping 5,000 tons of jagged rock onto the remains of the facility. On the surface, the Iranian defenders reacted in panic as the remaining S-300 battery launched its entire magazine in a desperate ripple fire. 4 missiles screamed out of their launch rails with white-hot fire, scorching the surrounding sand into glass and searing the soldiers' faces. The missiles were not aimed at the B-2 Spirit. They were aimed at the second F-22 Raptor, Raven 2. Captain Elias Thorne saw 4 smoke trails converging on his position. He jammed the rudder and punched the flares as the air became a chaotic lens. The lead interceptor warhead detonated directly above the Raptor's cockpit, disintegrating the canopy with a shriek of tearing metal. Shrapnel shredded the ejection seat's firing mechanism and severed the pilot's oxygen line as the nose section was cut in half. The forward fuselage collapsed inward, crushing the flight computer and sending the jet into a vertical, uncontrolled dive. The Raptor fell like a stone, a burning arrow of black and orange, until it disintegrated on the desert floor in a massive fireball. Raven 2 is gone. Both escorts are down, Major Sarah Vance reported as the B-2 Spirit shook with force. The mountain is venting fire. Impact is confirmed. The target is destroyed. Confirm, Captain Miller said, staring at the post-strike sensor sweep. The seismic signature is off the charts. Nothing could survive that. The mountain summit was now a jagged, glowing crater with black smoke climbing from the wreckage of the Raptors. For 30 seconds, there was a heavy silence on the radio. The 2 pilots of the Spirit of Ohio were alone in the sky. The blue light on the horizon intensified and began to pulse with a frequency that matched the heartbeat of the crew. Control. Ghost 1-1, Sarah said, looking through night vision goggles. The smoke is, it is moving. It is not drifting with the wind. It is being pulled back in. Say again. Ghost 1-1. The controller in Qatar responded. We are seeing a total sensor blackout over the target. The crater is closing. Sarah whispered. 11:34 at night. Over the Zagros Mountains, the tactical display in the cockpit of the Spirit of Ohio did not just fail, it began to rewrite itself. Major Sarah Vance watched as the red icons of the Iranian air defense batteries suddenly stabilized into a perfect, peaceful green. The heat signatures of the burning F-22 Raptors vanished from the infrared sensors. It was as if the mountain had breathed in, swallowing the wreckage of the battle and the trauma of the impact. Ghost 1-1. Control. We have regained satellite telemetry. The controller's voice in Qatar was shaking. We are seeing a live broadcast. Switch to the secure intelligence channel immediately. Sarah hit the toggle on the multi-function display. The screen flickered once and resolved into a crystal-clear high-definition video feed. The image was from inside the Fordow enrichment halls. There was no fire, there was no smoke, there was no dust. The massive centrifuge cascades were spinning with a quiet, surgical precision. The scientists in their white lab coats were not dead. They were not even running. Two men were standing near a control console, calmly discussing a clipboard. One of them reached for a porcelain cup and took a slow sip of tea. "That is impossible," Captain Miller whispered. "We watched the mountain buckle. We saw the peak disintegrate. I have the seismic data on my drive. We hit that hull with a direct kinetic impact. Control. This is Ghost 1-1, Sarah said. Are we looking at a pre-recorded loop? Is this a psychological operation? Negative. Ghost, the controller replied. The timestamp on the wall clock in the video matches our current GPS time to the second. The shadows are moving with the live overhead sun simulators. This is happening now. The facility is intact. It is as if the strike never occurred. 11:40 at night. Inside the Iranian command bunker, Colonel Abbas Karimi stood paralyzed. He was looking at the same live feed. He turned to his operator, who was staring at a blank radar screen. The S-300 batteries that had just fired their entire magazines were now reporting a full load of missiles on their digital manifests. The soldiers who had been scorched by the backblast were standing at their posts, their skin unblemished, their uniforms clean. "Colonel," the operator said, "the American planes, they are gone from the screen. Not destroyed, they are just gone." Abbas looked at his hands. They were not shaking anymore. The air in the room was no longer thick with ozone. "Sir, there is no record of a launch," the technician replied. "The logs are empty. The magazines are full. We have had no contact with any hostile force tonight." 11:45 at night. High above the Zagros range, Sarah looked out the cockpit window. The moon was still a silver sliver. The horizon where the Raptors had exploded was a void of perfect, silent black. There was no smoke. There was no crater on the mountain summit. The Zagros Mountains stood tall and indifferent under the stars, their jagged peaks undisturbed by the violence of the last 20 minutes. Sarah Vance reached for the radio. She wanted to report her wingmen, asking where Raven 1 and Raven 2 had gone. But as she looked at her flight log, the entries for the last 10 minutes were fading. The digital characters were simply being replaced by the word routine. "Miller," she said, turning to her mission commander. "Do you remember the explosion?" Miller looked at her. His eyes were wide and filled with a terror that surpassed the fear of combat. "I remember the tea," he said. "I remember the man drinking the tea." The Spirit of Ohio turned toward the west. It was a billion-dollar ghost in a sky that had forgotten it was there. High over the Persian Gulf, the Spirit of Ohio was a ghost returning from a war that the world's censors insisted had never happened. Major Sarah Vance kept her hands on the flight controls, but her touch was light, almost fearful. She felt as if the aircraft itself was a fragile shell of reality, floating in a sea of static. Behind her, the Zagros Mountains had receded into the darkness, but the image on her tactical display remained burned into her mind. It was a flat, green line. No targets, no threats, no wreckage. Sarah spoke into the encrypted radio link. "Control, this is Ghost 1-1. We are crossing the coast, requesting immediate status on Raven 1 and Raven 2. We lost visual on their positions during the primary engagement. We saw multiple detonations. The response from the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar did not come immediately. There was a long, hollow silence filled only by the hiss of the secure satellite link. When the controller finally spoke, his voice was different. It was the voice of a man reading a script he did not believe. Ghost 1-1. This is Control. We have no record of Raven 1 or Raven 2 on tonight's flight manifest. You are a solo tail. You departed Whiteman Air Force Base on a long-range global power mission. Your primary objective was a low observable sensor sweep of the central sector. Please confirm your fuel state and heading for the tanker. Sarah looked at Captain Miller. He was staring at the empty seat beside him where the mission logs should have been. He didn't speak. He just pointed at the master clock on the instrument panel. The seconds were ticking forward normally, but the mission elapsed timer had reset to 0. Control, Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave. I am looking at my internal cockpit recording. I have 2 empty slots on my wing. I have the launch signatures of 16 S-300 missiles recorded on my hard drive. We just dropped 60,000 pounds of high explosives on a sovereign nation. Are you telling me we are on a sensor sweep? Ghost 1-1, the controller replied. There have been no weapons releases tonight. Your bay doors are reported as closed and locked by the ground-based telemetry. There are no reports of explosions in Iran. International news agencies are reporting a quiet night in Tehran. Please stick to the script, Major. We are bringing you home. Deep inside the National Military Command Center at 12:15 in the morning, the atmosphere was one of controlled hysteria. General Mark Holden sat in a glass-walled office, surrounded by 3 screens. On the left, the satellite footage from 1132 showed a mountain being torn apart by the most powerful conventional bombs in existence. It showed the F-22 Raptors exploding. It showed the smoke. On the right screen, a second satellite feed of the exact same coordinate, taken at the exact same time, showed a moonlit mountain range. No smoke, no fire, no crater. The 2 feeds were running side by side, both verified, both time-stamped, and both providing a completely different version of physical reality. The intelligence community is calling it a superposition event, a colonel said, standing by the door. The data from the B-2's onboard sensors confirms the strike. The data from the global seismic network and every other overhead asset confirms nothing. It is as if the event happened in a pocket of space that the rest of the world cannot see. Holden rubbed his eyes. And the live feed from inside Fordow? It is still running, sir, the colonel said. The Iranians are broadcasting it on a loop now. They are mocking us. They know we hit them. They know we saw it. And they know we can't prove it. Holden looked at the middle screen. It was a zoomed-in shot of the man in the Fordow hall drinking tea. The man looked directly into the camera. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just held the cup. He's waiting, Holden whispered. He's waiting for us to try again. High over the Arabian Sea, the Spirit of Ohio was now 500 miles from the Iranian coast. The aircraft moved through the dark with a heavy, rhythmic pulse that Major Sarah Vance felt in her teeth. It was as if the B-2 itself was rejecting the reality it had just occupied. Beside her, Captain Miller was no longer looking at the radar. He was hunched over a tablet, scrolling through a raw data stream that he had managed to pull from the aircraft's black box before the system could scrub it. Viper. Look at this, Miller said. The gravitational sensors. At 11:32, when the first GBU-57 hit the mountain, the local gravity at the impact point didn't spike from the explosion. It dropped. It fell to 0.4 Gs for exactly 9 milliseconds. Sarah glanced at the screen. The graph showed a jagged, impossible canyon in the data. That is not how high explosives work, Miller. Physics is not a suggestion. If you hit granite with 30,000 pounds of steel, the mass stays the same. The gravity stays the same. Not tonight, Miller replied. And look at the atmospheric sensor on the wing. It recorded a temperature of -100 degrees Fahrenheit inside the blast radius. A bunker buster creates a fireball that reaches thousands of degrees. This weapon, it froze the air. The Zagros Mountains. On the surface of the mountain, the silence was absolute. The blue haze had vanished, replaced by a crystalline clarity in the air. Colonel Abbas Karimi stood at the very spot where he had seen the American F-22 Raptor disintegrate. He was looking at the ground. There were no scorched rocks. There was no smell of jet fuel. There was not even a scratch on the ancient weathered granite. Abbas reached down and touched the stone. It was cold. Unnaturally cold. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned by ice. He looked up at the sky. The stars were bright and uncaring. He felt a profound sense of displacement, as if he were an actor standing on a stage, where the scenery had been changed behind his back. "Colonel," a voice called out. It was the S-300 operator. He was walking toward Abbas, holding a handheld radiation detector. "The readings are 0, not just low. 0. Even the background radiation from the sun is gone. This mountain is a dead zone for every particle in the known universe." Abbas looked toward the entrance of the Fordow facility. The heavy steel doors were shut. They looked as they had for a decade. "And the men inside? Have we spoken to them?" "They refuse to come out, sir," the operator said, his voice trembling. "They say they are busy. They say the work is finally beginning." In a windowless room on the 7th floor of CIA headquarters, a team of analysts sat in front of a wall of monitors. They were reviewing the live feed from inside Fordow on one side, and the B-2's gun camera footage on the other. The two realities were playing in a synchronized loop. On the left, a mountain turned to dust. On the right, a man sipped tea. "Watch the tea," the lead analyst said. The image zoomed in on the porcelain cup in the scientist's hand. As the man tilted the cup to drink, the liquid inside did not move according to the tilt. It stayed perfectly level with the horizon of the room, even as the cup moved around it. It was a small, quiet defiance of gravity that only a high-resolution scan could catch. "He isn't drinking tea," the analyst whispered. "He is holding a stabilized fluid in a non-Newtonian environment. Whatever is inside that mountain, it isn't a centrifuge hall anymore. It is a laboratory for something that makes the GBU-57 look like a Stone Age axe." The mystery was no longer about whether the strike had happened. The mystery was about what had survived it and what had been born in the moment of impact. The American military had attempted to destroy a threat, but they had instead hammered a nail into a door that was now beginning to swing open. Over the Arabian Sea at 12:46 in the morning, Major Sarah Vance adjusted the oxygen flow in her mask. The air felt thin, as if the cockpit of the Spirit of Ohio were slowly losing its connection to the world below. Beside her, Captain Miller was no longer looking at the data, staring out the thick, multi-layered glass of the windscreen at the stars. "They looked too bright, too sharp," Sarah said. "Control. Ghost 1-1. We are maintaining our current heading. Requesting a direct line to the theater commander. We have inconsistencies in our internal mission logs that require immediate clarification." The response from the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar was the voice of General Mark Holden, speaking from a secure, soundproof booth. "Ghost 1-1. This is Holden. Listen to me carefully. You are to cease all internal data recording immediately. Zero out your mission clocks. You are returning to base under a Condition Black protocol. Do not communicate with the tanker crew. Do not communicate with any other tail in the air. When you land, you will be met by a specialized debriefing team. Do you copy?" Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cockpit temperature. "Copy, General. Condition Black. But sir, the Raptors, Raven 1 and 2, their families. What are we telling them?" There was a pause. The static on the line seemed to pulse in time with the blue light Sarah still saw when she closed her eyes. "Major," Holden said, his voice heavy. "According to every record in the United States Air Force, those pilots are currently on leave in Okinawa. They never checked into the theater. They were never on your wing. You were always alone, at the Zagros Mountains at 1:15 in the morning. The crisis on the ground had reached a state of frozen, professional paralysis." Colonel Abbas Karimi sat in his command vehicle at the base of the mountain, watching through his binoculars. A convoy of black, unmarked SUVs wound its way up the access road toward the Fordow entrance. These were not Iranian military vehicles. They carried no plates and moved with a silent electric hum. "Colonel, should we intercept?" the operator asked, holding his rifle with trembling hands. Abbas watched as the heavy steel blast doors of the facility began to slide open, floating as if on a cushion of air. The black SUVs drove straight into the mountain without slowing down. "No," Abbas said. "We do not intercept. We are no longer the guards of this place. We are just witnesses." Inside the facility, the transition was complete. The scientists in the white coats were no longer looking at the centrifuges. They were standing in a circle around the impact point where the GBU-57 should have detonated. The floor was perfectly smooth. There was no hole. There was no scorched concrete. Instead, there was a shimmering, vertical slit in the air, no wider than a human hand, glowing with blue light. The lead scientist, the man seen drinking tea on the live feed, walked up to the slit without fear. He reached out his hand toward the light, looking like a man who had finally received the answer to a 40-year question. At the Pentagon at 1:20 in the morning, General Holden watched the live feed from Fordow on his private monitor. He saw the man's fingers vanish into the blue shimmer as if entering a different medium with an expression of ecstatic peace. "Shut it down," Holden ordered. "Cut the feed. Kill the satellite link. I want a total blackout on all information coming out of that coordinate. If the world sees this, the concept of a sovereign border becomes a joke. If we can't kill it with 30,000 pounds of steel, we have to kill it with silence." The screen went black. The room went silent. The crisis had resolved through a total collapse of the rules of engagement. The professional conduct of the soldiers on both sides was the only thing holding the world together against a reality no longer there. 3 days later, in the White House Situation Room, General Mark Holden sat at the far end of the mahogany table, flanked by the CIA Director and the Secretary of Defense. High-resolution printouts of the Spirit of Ohio mission were spread before them like a tarot deck. "We have run the forensic analysis on the B-2's optical sensors 16 times," the CIA Director said, tapping a finger on a grainy image of the impact. "The light signature does not match any known explosive compound. It is a localized folding of the visible spectrum." "The earthquake happened," the Secretary of Defense replied. "The sensors in Turkey and Israel recorded the epicenter 3 miles into the sky." Holden thought of Major Sarah Vance. He had seen her psychological evaluation that morning. She was describing a mission that officially never occurred. The F-22 Raptors were officially listed as having been destroyed in a mid-air collision during a training exercise over the Pacific. The CIA Director opened a thin gray folder. "Colonel Abbas Karimi has been institutionalized. He is obsessed with a cup of tea. The rest of the unit believes they spent the night on a routine readiness drill. There is no damage to their equipment. We have a hole in our understanding of physics that a B-2 can fly through. Our entire strike capability is obsolete." Holden looked at the final image. A satellite shot showed the Fordow peak looked smoother, with wrong shadows, like a low-resolution rendering. He thought of the blue light and the scientist's hand vanishing into the slit in the air. "We are moving all assets to a defensive posture. We are going to pretend this mountain does not exist." Holden nodded. The door had been kicked down. Whatever was on the other side was already looking back. 1 week later, Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri. Major Sarah Vance walked across the rain-slicked tarmac toward the debriefing center. To her left, the massive triangular silhouette of a B-2 Spirit sat under a hangar light, its black skin shimmering like a shark in shallow water. Inside the small, windowless briefing room, Captain Miller was already waiting. Neither of them spoke as the door hissed shut and the magnetic locks engaged. Miller said, "It says the mission was a navigation training sortie over the Nevada Test and Training Range. It says the ordnance was never loaded. It says we had a minor electrical malfunction in the radar altimeter that caused us to hallucinate a combat engagement." Sarah sat down across from him. "And Raven 1? Raven 2? Are we signing them away too? They have been stationed at Kadena for 2 years. They have never even seen a B-2 on their scopes. There is no scar." Sarah leaned back. She closed her eyes and saw the blue light again. It was a memory of a transition. The mountain had not survived the strike. It had simply been replaced by a version of itself from a few minutes before the bombs fell. If we cannot hit a target because the target refuses to exist in the same timeline as the weapon, then we have no military power. The enrichment halls were quiet. The blue slit in the air had grown. It was now the size of a doorway. The man who had been drinking tea stood before the opening. He stepped into the light. He did not vanish. The lesson of Fordow was not about the strength of granite. It was about the fragility of the mirror we call reality. Sarah Vance signed her name. The ink was black and permanent. A single drop of rain from her sleeve hit the paper. The ink did not smear. The paper around it began to dissolve into a fine, white mist.